From the use of cables that hold these technological marvels in place, to the specific weaving technique involved in the making of the Brooklyn Bridge, here's how suspension bridges cross the ocean. Now, believe it or not, this miracle of modern architecture is held in place thanks to cables. These are called the suspenders. These suspender cables are pretty much the reason hundreds of vehicles can safely get across bodies of water. The curved cables are connected to much larger cables, which are secured to the towers on either side, as well as being anchored to the ground. You really can't pass up the extra measure of security. Now keep in mind, these anchors are at least 3 to 4 feet tall on either side. And that might be even bigger for some of the larger suspension bridges out there. It's the reason why these bridges are able to support a ton of weight. Take the Golden Gate Bridge as an example. That behemoth of modern engineering can hold up to 4,000 pounds per foot. No wonder people love viewing it with their own eyes. It's really one of those things you've got to see to believe. Anyway, there are still tons of other details that go into installing these bridges. One is that the purpose of these bridges as a whole is to enable the deck to withstand compression forces, brought on by the weight being transmitted from the heavy cables through the suspenders as they pass between the towers. The force then follows the cables through the towers and is passed straight to the ground. It's pretty interesting when you think about it. And let's not forget that each part of the bridge has a strong role to play. You need strong anchors, or else the weight of the cables would straight up take the tower down, collapsing right down on the bridge. Saying those things are heavy is an understatement. But of course, the towers are necessary too. You need them to pass the weight through the cables and into the ground. It's like a cool little jigsaw puzzle. You need every part working together for it all to function at the end. Plus, the cables and suspenders have to be capable enough to hold the weight being applied to the deck. Keep in mind, it takes as little as a single snap for the entire bridge to fall down, along with whatever and whoever was on it. This is one of those situations you definitely don't want to mess up. Luckily, when they do work out, suspension bridges are super useful. Not only do they help cover long spans, but they're also usually placed over oceans and other bodies of water, allowing for easier access to people on each side. The Akashi Kaikyo Bridge in Japan, for example, has a massive central span of 2,000 meters between its two towers. And interestingly, despite their large sizes, suspension bridges tend to be relatively cheap to make. You don't need nearly as much support as some other bridges, and even with a minimal amount of supplies, the job can be done well, as long as you have decent people handling the project. And believe it or not, even though the majority of the famous suspension bridges you may imagine are used by cars, there are tons of smaller ones across the world too. Usually, these are just for pedestrian and natural enthusiasts. But there are a couple of really cool ones up in the mountains too, like one in Golden, British Columbia, or Cannon City, Colorado. But of course, you can't talk about suspension bridges without mentioning what's probably the most iconic one of all, the Golden Gate Bridge. I talked about how much weight it can hold earlier, but really, it wouldn't be doing justice to this amazing bridge if we didn't go over some of its history. In light of this, some individuals might believe that the bridge bears the name of the California Gold Rush. While the history of the bridge does relate to that period of time, it is not completely founded on it. Here's what really happened. The concept of the bridge came from James Wilkins. At the time, Wilkins was just an engineering student working with a San Francisco paper. The bright-eyed student pitched the idea of creating a suspension bridge, one that would be over 3,000 feet long and cost around $100 million to build. Of course, no one thought it was possible, and folks let him know that. Though I'm sure deep down, everyone wanted to see it actually happen. After all, something like that would go down in history, and well, it did. Once all this commotion was caused, it was impossible to get the idea out of people's heads. And in specific, many decades later, San Francisco City engineer Michael M. O'Shaughnessy realized he wanted in on the hype. He contacted a couple of like-minded engineers and began work on what folks know as the Golden Gate Bridge today. Soon enough, engineer and poet Joseph Strauss entered the picture. He also believed it could be done, and what's more, he wanted to make sure it was done right. So the guy took the project on and claimed it could be done with a $25 to $30 million budget. While it looked like things were off to a great start, they hit a roadblock pretty early on. Any guesses? Yup, the Great Depression. At this point, nearly 50 years had passed since the plan was originally pitched, And well, things weren't looking too good. But then, in 1932, something close to a miracle happened. San Francisco-based Bank of America decided to take on the project and fund it themselves. And by 1933, construction of the bridge was in full swing. At the time, the safety measures taken when making the bridge were considered to be extremely strict. Probably the strictest that existed for that era. Hard hats were made mandatory for all the workers, as well as respirators and glare-free goggles. Working that high up in the sky above water can lead to blindness, and the last thing you want to do at that height is inhale the fumes. A safety net had also been installed under the bridge to catch any fallen workers. And turns out 19 men were saved because of it. People like to refer to them as the Halfway to Hell Club these days. Sadly, despite these measures, 11 men did give their lives for this project. 1 as a result of falling, and 10 when they fell onto the safety net, along with a heavy piece of equipment. But there are other suspension bridges with unique and interesting stories too. Akashi Kaikyo Bridge is also among the coolest suspension bridges out there. The original plan for the bridge was for it to be a mixed railway road bridge. But when construction started all the way back in 1988, the team switched gears, making it restricted to roads only. The area around the bridge is among some of Japan's most unstable, with pretty heavy seismic activity being the norm. This was seen even during the bridge's construction period in 1955. This is when the Great Hanshin earthquake hit the area, but luckily the bridge didn't undergo any significant damage. That's because the team behind it used anti-seismic building methods. By 1996, construction was already finished, with the bridge being open for traffic in 1998. Pretty fast turnaround, right? Obviously, with a bridge this cool, you need a proper ceremony. And the then Crown Prince Naruhito and his spouse, Crown Princess Masako, officiated the ceremony. Finally, there's one other really interesting bridge I've got to talk about, and that's the Brooklyn Bridge. John Augustus Roebling was the mastermind behind this project. He came up with his own method on how to weave the wire cables, and let's just say, this guy's a bit of a legend when it comes to suspension bridges. He was responsible for a number of bridges, including the Cincinnati-Covington Bridge, but sadly, the Brooklyn Bridge proved to be his final project. That's because he died in an accident on site, causing his son to take over the project. There were tons of other issues during construction, but in the end, the project was a success. To celebrate its completion, Emily Roebling, wife of John's son, rode the first carriage across the bridge. She carried a rooster as a symbol of victory, and I've got to say, it was totally earned after the sheer work and effort they'd gone through to complete the project. After all, the building of it represented a technological landmark at the time. So from the specific weaving technique involved in the making of the Brooklyn Bridge, to the use of cables that hold these technological marvels in place, this was how suspension bridges cross the ocean. Also, if you want to see stories about other mega projects, watch one of these videos right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.